Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're really excited. We have a great turnout today. We're, I think, approaching 200 participants. My name is Shah Aklog. I'm the Chairman and CEO of PAVmed and the Executive Chairman of Veris Health. You know, as those of you who are shareholders or follow PAVmed closely, you know, we take pride in providing or trying to provide full and transparent information to the community. We've heard and agree that it can be difficult to go into enough depth on various topics during our quarterly calls, especially given all of the recent activity around Lucid. That's why I'm really excited to be hosting this event, which will give us the opportunity to do a much deeper dive into a very important part of PAVmed's portfolio, our new digital health company, Veris Health, which I believe will contribute substantially to our shareholders' value in the coming years. We have a great panel today. Joining me are Dr. James Mitchell, who's the PAVmed Vice President of Digital Health and the Chief Medical Officer of Veris Health. He's also the co-founder and former CEO of OncoDisc, which is the company that Veris Health acquired. Joining us later will be Dr. Sumit Shah, who's an oncologist and a member of our medical advisory board. He's the Director of Clinical Innovation and Digital Health in the Division of Oncology at the Stanford Cancer Institute, Stanford Healthcare. Also joining us is Tim Baxter, who's a member of PAVmed's board of directors. He's also the former president and CEO of Samsung Electronics North America. And then finally, just joined us yesterday is I welcome Sunny Webb, who's PAVmed's vice president of data and analytics, and also will serve as Veris's chief technology officer. We have a pretty packed agenda today. So over the next couple of hours, we'll cover a lot of topics. I'll start with a corporate overview of PAVmed and its strategy, how our entry into the digital health space and acquisition of OncoDisc fits within that strategy. Dr. Mitchell will describe the Veris Health overall and its technology, the unmet clinical need, hardware, software, as well as the business model and future applications. Ms. Webb will provide us with some insights on the opportunity to apply data analytics in healthcare, including some use cases. Then there's a pre-recorded session where Dr. Mitchell and Shah will participate in what we'll call the Clinician's Corner, where two oncologists will discuss the opportunities to improve cancer care through using digital health tools. Then we'll have a panel discussion. We'll open it up to an audience Q&A. Any member of the audience will be able to submit a question through the chat. And then I'll finally wrap things up at the end. So let's start with PAVmed. What is PAVmed after the Lucid IPO? I get asked that a lot, and that's really a question of what's our long-term growth strategy. So PAVmed, let's start with is a highly differentiated multi-product commercial stage medical technology company. We co-founded the company in 2014. And PAVmed went public on NASDAQ in 2016 and has built up a diversified product portfolio of groundbreaking technologies that address important unmet needs. And we have a business model that's focused on speed to market. Although we started in the traditional medical device realm, we've expanded our portfolio to include medical diagnostics and now digital health. So PAVmed, we like to think of it as an innovation and value creation engine. We have a growing team. We're approaching 70 employees now, and also a broad network or ecosystem that we work around that provides us with really the full spectrum of expertise and skill sets across the development of devices, diagnostics, and now digital technologies from product design and development, clinical trials, regulatory, manufacturing. We have a CLIA certified laboratory, as well as commercialization. Let's dive that into a little bit further, what I mean by that. What I mean by that is that we feed PAVmed through internal innovation. So many of the products in our portfolio were invented by founders or other members of the company, as well as licensing or acquiring technologies. And we've done that so far four times in the history of the company. Those lead to a series of products within our portfolio. Some of them are still within PAVmed, and others have been spun off into major subsidiaries. So when we talk to our shareholders, and especially those long-term shareholders, what stands out with PAVmed, where we have this innovation and value creation engine that works under a shared services model. What's attractive to our investors is it provides a diversified and expanding or expandable portfolio as we encounter technologies such as this one and others. It provides multiple shots on goal. Our success is non-binary. It's not dependent on one particular FDA clearance or one particular clinical trial, but on success across the spectrum, which in turn provides risk mitigation and economies of scale. So our two major subsidiaries are in the diagnostic realm is Lucid Diagnostics, which is in the business of early detection of esophageal precancer. And of course, the topic of today in the digital health sector, Veris Health, which is a digital cancer care platform and intelligent vascular port. I would like to just digress briefly to Lucid to tell a bit of the Lucid story to set the stage for where we hope to take Veris. So Lucid is a commercial stage cancer prevention medical diagnostics company. We founded it in 2018 to license technologies underlying two products, EsoGuard and EsoCheck, from Case Western Reserve University, and representing an estimated $25 billion total addressable market opportunity. At the time, in 2018, we paid just $50,000 in cash, and we were able to retain 82% equity in Lucid and the technologies that it licensed. Lucid was managed and financed by PAVmed since its inception, and PAVmed put a total of approximately $30 million over that 3.5-year period. During that time, we were able to advance EsoGuard and EsoCheck from the research laboratory and a working prototype to the commercial realm with now active expanding sales force and activity across the country. We were able to secure an attractive $1,900 Medicare payment. And excitingly, a couple of weeks ago, we were able to consummate a NASDAQ IPO on October 14th. We were able to raise $70 million in growth capital to fund our growth strategy at a $467 million valuation. PAVmed's stake pre-IPO was 72.7%. And based on how we structured Lucid, its post-IPO stake actually rose to 75.5% despite the capital that was raised into the company. So again, what is our long-term strategy? What is PAVmed after the Lucid IPO? And the most succinct way to say it is more Lucids. That's really our strategy, is to continue to create value through the licensing or internal innovation of technologies and build them into either within PAVmed proper or increasingly through major subsidiaries. So why did we enter the digital health space, or digital health and really smart devices? There's a revolution going on in this area. You don't have to spend too much time in the media, and particularly the business media, to know that. And there have been a variety of these are just 4 examples of really remarkable examples of value creation in this space. Livongo went out and just as recently as 2019 at a $350 million IPO and was acquired by Teladoc in 2020 for $18 billion. The multiples in this space have been really quite high. iRhythm, similar story. It's a $100 million IPO in 2016. Now is worth about $7 billion. Flatiron, which actually is in the cancer space, was founded in 2012 and was acquired by Roche in 2018 for over $2 billion. And Biotelemetry, a company that's been around for a while, did a smaller IPO in 2008, was also acquired in 2020 in the $2.8 billion range. So large valuations, large multiples. And just like the diagnostic space was a hot sector in 2018 when we founded Lucid, we determined that this was really an upcoming sector, and we thought we wanted to get into it. We acknowledge there might be some hype and frothiness, but the fundamentals are solid. We have about 20% of the economy, which is what healthcare represents, that's finally leveraging digital tools that have been long available in other sectors. And I think anyone who's paying attention would understand that COVID has accelerated and solidified this trend towards digitalization. And I think the markets have responded accordingly. So when we acquired when we acquired Oncodisk and created Veris Health to house it, there were numerous aspects of this transaction that we found attractive. And I'll go through them one by one because I think it's important, particularly for the PAVmed investors on this call, to understand what our thinking was in acquiring this technology. First, required, similar to Lucid, a very modest upfront consideration. We paid $155,000, and we retained almost exact same equity stake in Veris as we did in Lucid. The technology, as you'll see, is groundbreaking with good IP protection, large addressable initial market in cancer care that meets an clear unmet need, large population, with benefits to both the physicians and patients. And there's a large expanded market opportunity, which we'll touch on a bit in renal failure and heart failure. The timelines were attractive. The hurdles in terms of regulatory hurdles were acceptable. And we felt we could advance this into commercialization with modest capital and resource investments. One thing that really caught our attention was the attractive reimbursement model. There are existing established codes. As we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, there's a recurring revenue model here. And there is also existing CMS bonuses and incentives that we think will come into play. In addition to the reimbursement model, there are also large additional value creation opportunities through the monetization of data and also partnering with pharma to do clinical research support. And we also felt there were excellent synergies with PAVmed's infrastructure, particularly on the device development side. We inherited a very strong and esteemed medical advisory board. You can see here, I won't go through all the names. Again, Dr. Shah from Stanford is joining us today, but you can see we have advisors from major institutions across the country, Dana-Farber in Boston and others, as well as busy, active, accomplished private practice clinician oncologists as well. Also just wanted to highlight one aspect. This is a topic that comes up a lot in the digital health realm, and that's the notion of digital therapeutics. And I'm going to use the term digital healthcare to contrast it from digital therapeutics. When we talk about digital healthcare, we're talking about using digital tools to improve care within existing sort of facility, doctor, and patient paradigms. The digital platform is really important, but it's an enabling tool. It's not the therapy itself. And as a result, because we're working within existing paradigms, we can leverage existing reimbursement models. And to the extent to which data monetization is important, and we think it is, it's really to expand on the value opportunity. In contrast, the whole realm of digital therapeutics is somewhat different. And we don't think we need to go there. We think we have a really great differentiated opportunity without having to enter into the digital therapeutics realm. In digital therapeutics, you're creating an actual new digital treatment or digital treatment products on an iPhone or Android or other technology, and it's primarily focused on patient self-care, not facilitating your interaction with doctors or healthcare facilities. So in a sense, a digital platform is the therapy itself. And it really inherits sort of an eyeballs model of other app-based applications outside of healthcare, and reimbursement and regulatory hurdles can be challenging. In a sense, they're creating a new reimbursement model. And the data monetization in many examples is the primary value creator. There's not really the opportunity to create value just from the interaction of the patient with the device. It's monetizing the data that's the primary source of value. So having made that contrast, I'm going to hand the reins over to Dr. James Mitchell, who's our Chief Medical Officer, who'll be giving you an overview of Veris Health. Jimmy, take it over from here.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Aklog, for the background and the great introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining today. I'm James Mitchell. I am the Chief Medical Officer of Veris Health, VP of Digital Health at PAVmed. My background is in radiation oncology. I have over 15 years of experience as a clinical oncologist. Also been developing medical technology for the last decade. And very excited to be joining the PAVmed team and Veris Health and telling you today why we're building what we're building and giving you the details of our technology. So I'll start off by touching on the unmet need that we're addressing. Why are we building this platform at Veris Health? And really it comes down to today, oncologists have a difficulty managing risks associated with cancer care and underlying the disease of cancer. Cancer patients largely undergo outpatient treatment. There are many months of multiple cycles of chemotherapy, immunotherapy, radiation therapy. And this episodic care means that most of the time, patients are at home and completely unmonitored, but at a high risk of developing complications. This can be infection or dehydration or uncontrolled pain. There's a whole list of potential complications that then lead to unplanned hospital admissions. So every year in the United States, there are about 1.5 million unplanned hospital admissions in cancer patients, and those become very expensive as they can cost up to $70,000 per patient on average. But we also know through cancer research that 19 to 50% of these hospitalizations are potentially preventable with appropriate, timely outpatient interventions. And so, if we dive into this problem a bit deeper, why does this impact everyone in cancer care? It's clear that this is a problem for patients, but really, this is a problem for all of the stakeholders in cancer treatment. For patients, it's clear. Patients who spend a lot of time in the hospital means that they're away from their family, they suffer poor quality of life, and we even see shortened survival. Often we have to stop cancer treatment altogether to deal with complications and hospitalizations. The oncologists and the nurses themselves who are taking care of the cancer patients, not only is it demoralizing to have a lot of patients in the hospital suffering complications, it's also very inefficient use of the care team's time and resources. It's very expensive and time consuming to care for patients in the hospital, and it takes us away from the mission of caring for new cancer patients in the cancer clinic. For hospitals and health systems, hospitals have to report quality metrics to Medicare. And one of the key metrics that have to be reported is the rate of complication and hospitalizations in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. If hospitals don't report these metrics, they can take a 2% hit across the board from Medicare reimbursement. And if they do report metrics and their metrics are bad, that becomes public information and makes it difficult for those hospitals to negotiate contracts with private payers. And then in addition, as we move more towards value-based care, hospitals and health systems are taking on more of that financial risk of caring for patients and therefore having to pay for complications out of pocket. With payers, it's pretty clear. Every time a patient gets hospitalized or we have to leverage resources to cover complications, that hits payers at the bottom line. But as we widen the lens a little bit and we look at even pharmaceutical companies, every time we have to stop treatment to manage complications, that's fewer doses delivered of the pharmaceutical company's products. Now, we actually have data in the oncology literature to show that using technology to connect patients and doctors can not only reduce costs of care, but also improve outcomes. One large study out of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York showed that a simple online platform that allowed patients to enter symptom data not only reduced visits to the emergency department, cutting on costs, but prolonged overall survival by over 5 months in patients with advanced cancer undergoing chemotherapy. Now, this is remarkable because that is a bigger survival benefit than we actually see with most new chemotherapy or immunotherapy drugs that get approved for use in cancer. We've also seen data that capturing objective parameters, such as activity tracking, can predict survival outcomes in cancer patients. But research shows that adherence to wearable or in-home technology starts off poor and falls quickly afterwards in cancer patients. One study out of UCSF looking at the use of Fitbit in breast cancer patients showed that 16% of patients never even turned the device on, and only 44% actually used the technology during their chemotherapy. So we know that technology can provide benefits, but we also need a better solution. Now, the cancer market is large and growing. Every year around the world, 17 million individuals are diagnosed with cancer, and approximately 10 million of those will require first-line chemotherapy. And actually, of those, over 7 million are potentially eligible for the newer immunotherapy drugs. And these numbers are increasing as we see an aging population and increasing cancer incidence. If we take a look at the global smart healthcare market, this is technology enabled medical devices and other supporting equipment, data gathering tools. This market has skyrocketed, much like the IoT market across the board, growing to about $170 billion in 2020. So let's look at our solution. The Veris Health solution is truly a platform that integrates three parts. First is an intelligent implantable device. We'll talk about the details in a moment. We have a software platform with interfaces for the patient as well as for the care team, with those interfaces streamlined to meet the needs of each constituency. And the data. The data is where we will unlock those insights that will allow oncologists to take better care of patients, but also provide the foundation for broader insights and an expanded customer base. Our device is the world's first intelligent implantable vascular access port. Vascular access ports are devices that are used every day today in cancer care. They are fully implanted inside the body and can stay in place for many, many months, on average about 6 to 9 months, typically for the full duration of a patient's cancer treatment. They provide the access to the blood vessels that is required to infuse anti-cancer medications. So that could be immunotherapy, targeted agents, CAR T, and traditional chemotherapy. You can draw blood through these devices to send to the lab for laboratory testing. You can even infuse contrast agents for diagnostic tests, such as MRI or PET CT imaging. There is existing workflow and existing reimbursement for these devices today, and a very large proportion of cancer patients are undergoing implantation of these devices right now. Our device is the world's first intelligent implantable vascular access port. So vascular access ports today don't have any intelligent technology embedded in them. We are loading our device with sensor data storage and data communication technology so that we can capture data on patient physiology from inside the body with unmatched accuracy and in an uninterrupted way that's going to provide oncologists with clinical insights that we've never had access to before, so that we can detect complications early, like an early fever, trigger timely interventions, and prevent those costly hospitalizations. Our 1.0 device will monitor an array of physiologic parameters, including core body temperature, heart rate, respiratory rates, activity, which is an important predictive metric for cancer patients, central venous pressures, which are the blood pressures of the veins draining into the right side of the heart, as well as the ability to capture heart sounds and breath sounds and the diagnostic information that we can glean from that. In the future devices will have a broader suite of sensor and data capabilities, including physical parameters such as oxygen saturation and cardiac rhythm, as well as looking at biochemical processes of the body, such as glucose levels, lactate levels, which can be an early sign of critical infection, as well as pH and electrolytes. So where are we today? We closed our acquisition of OncoDisc by Veris Health in June of this year and accelerated development and have made remarkable progress in that time, a real testament to the people and the business model at PAVmed. Just recently, we completed a concept phase where we created and tested multiple different prototypes. We did in vivo testing of catheter-based prototypes with sensors, including temperature, pressure, electrodes to capture cardiac electrical activity, implanted microphones to capture those breath sounds and heart sounds, as well as many tests around the ability to transmit all of this data wirelessly from an implanted location through the skin to a mobile device, and characterizing the power consumption with different modes of data transmission. So our near-term R&D plan is to move aggressively into that design phase along with our manufacturing partners so that we can then move quickly into manufacturing, testing, and filing for regulatory clearance. We expect that we will be going down the 510(k) pathway with the FDA and that we will be filing that in the second half of 2022. Now, beyond the device, we're building an incredible software platform that will allow the oncology team to unlock those clinical insights, but will also keep patients engaged in their care and allow the ability to report symptoms. Now, we're very excited about our partners in this development process. We're working with Microsoft as part of their global partnership solutions to build our platform on their Azure cloud database, utilizing the infrastructure that they've spent years developing with HIPAA-compliant cloud computing, data security, and interoperability as they build not just the foundation, but the data highways that are really going to unlock the healthcare of the future. We've seen a lot of this just recently as they announced a big partnership in interoperability with Cerner, and they're also building this out with Epic. Those are the two biggest electronic health records in the country. And we're building this in conjunction with Loka, a top-tier, full-stack, Silicon Valley-based software development firm. They're building the platform on Azure and leveraging their experience in healthcare as well as other cutting-edge technology industries to build the data platform of the future for cancer care and then beyond, as we'll touch on in a moment. We look at some of the features for the patient-facing application. This is largely a mobile application that will allow patients to not only view the data of their own health that's coming off of the device will communicate directly with the patient's mobile phone, but will also allow patients to enter symptoms, which is critical to their care. And as we learned from that Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center study, can be critical in improving outcomes. So here we've shown an example of some of that workflow where we can either detect a problem or patients can initiate symptom reporting. They can provide structured data about those symptoms so we can use it on our analytics platform. And then they can receive feedback either automated from the platform or directly from their care team. And then for the doctors and nurses taking care of cancer patients, we're building an interface that will integrate directly into their workflow, integrate with the electronic health record platforms that they're using in clinic today, but will also be designed to provide them concise, easily digestible, but most importantly, actionable information about their patients. They can triage patients virtually so they know exactly which patients require their attention. And this is where we're really able to leverage our own experience as clinicians and our amazing medical advisory board to ensure that we are making the lives of the oncologists and the nurses easier as they take better care of their patients, and we're not disrupting their workflow. Now, our business model is built upon existing reimbursement that exists today for both implantation of devices, port devices, as well as remote patient monitoring. And so we don't have to create any new codes or any new reimbursement to start selling immediately. The remote patient monitoring codes that are approved by Medicare provide the hospitals and oncology practices with recurring revenue and in turn allows us to build our model as a subscription-based recurring revenue model as well, where ultimately our gross margins will approach those of a typical software company at around 90% gross margins. Now, if we look at those remote patient monitoring codes, these are by and large not being used today by cancer programs because there is not a solution like ours that allows the hospitals or cancer centers to build these codes. So we will actually be opening up a new revenue stream for the typical cancer program. So our sales team will be targeting oncologists in all different settings. We've segmented the oncology market. We know who are the integrated health systems, who are the large academic centers performing research, and who are the community practices that are likely to adopt this technology. And we will be selling directly to those oncology decision makers. And once we have a foothold in this market, we can expand this business model beyond patient care and Medicare or private payer reimbursement and look at really starting to monetize data. So how can we do that? Who's interested in this data that we're going to be aggregating and building analytics for? Well, this is really every stakeholder in cancer care and in healthcare in general. If we look at the pharmaceutical companies, they have demonstrated a real hunger for data-driven digital solutions that can be a companion to their existing pharmacologic products, but can also help them unlock insights into the current marketplace using real-world data. And very importantly, data that can support their clinical trial mission for the drug discovery process. You imagine the ability to in real time monitor every patient that's enrolled on a phase 3 drug discovery clinical trial that would allow these investigators to identify adverse events in real time and address those adverse events and keep patients going on study. We've seen many acquisitions in the digital space by pharmaceutical companies, as well as partnerships for research and commercialization. We saw Flatiron by Roche earlier in this presentation. Roche has actually acquired multiple digital companies. Bayer has as well. And every large pharmaceutical company today has a digital arm looking at this type of technology. Hospitals and health systems can not only use this data to improve individual patient care, but can look at their programs as a whole, look at both clinical outcomes as well as economic outcomes, and use this data to improve their own efficiencies and save on their expenses. And even payers, of course, payers are always looking for technology that's going to lower their expenses, their costs, but they also have to report their own metrics, such as HEDIS metrics that are based on outcomes within their networks. And those are important as they then go on and negotiate new contracts with new clients. So where are we going in the future? We've talked a lot about cancer care today and our existing technology. We see a lot of ways to expand our cancer-facing technology, either through new sensor technology or enhanced analytics of our data. The image that we see here is imagery around advanced catheter systems with electronics and sensors embedded in those catheters. Some of this will be used in our technology today and will grow in the future. But what really excites us is the opportunity to leverage this technology for new indications and other disease processes. So specifically looking at cardiovascular diseases like congestive heart failure and renal diseases, such as patients with end-stage kidney disease who require hemodialysis. These are diseases that impact huge numbers of the population. There are extremely large healthcare costs associated with caring for these patients. And like cancer patients, they are at very high risk of developing complications that lead to hospitalizations. But on top of that, these are also diagnoses and disorders where there is a tradition and a workflow around using devices and having that be part of the care pathway. So much like cancer care, we can seamlessly integrate into those care pathways and provide technology that's going to open up um, benefits to huge numbers of patients. So why did we decide to have this full platform with device, software, and data, especially including the intelligent vascular access port? If we look at the other solutions that are out there today, there is no solution that really checks all the boxes, that provides the uninterrupted data that we need for true patient care, that tucks easily into the existing workflow, that leverages existing reimbursement, and really takes advantage of some of the telemedicine and patient-reported outcomes technology that we've seen really hit its stride during COVID. Software-only solutions don't gather any data, and there's questionable reimbursement for software solutions. Wearable technologies don't really check any of the boxes. And there are intelligent implants on the market, but they aren't for cancer care. These are very specific to targeted patients with things like cardiovascular diseases or diabetes. So what will this look like for a typical patient who develops a complication? Well, let's look at dehydration, which is a very common complication in cancer patients and can lead to bigger problems such as kidney failure. So we have Rebecca. Rebecca's a lung cancer patient who's undergoing both immunotherapy and chemotherapy. She has these medications infused through her intelligent port. And like every other cancer patient, she goes home. And while she's at home, she starts to develop common side effects of this treatment of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. She feels bad, so she's eating and drinking less. And so by day 3, she's starting to show signs of dehydration. And by day 7, these are really starting to trigger changes in her physiology, meaning that her heart rate is increasing, she's moving around less, but her temperature is normal. It doesn't look like she's developing an infection. This is all consistent with dehydration, and our platform will detect these changes and send her some targeted questions to answer about her symptoms, while also alerting the oncology team, who can very quickly interpret this data, schedule a video telehealth visit with Rebecca, and understand that she's showing early signs of dehydration. But because we've detected this in a timely way, we don't have to admit her to the hospital. We can just bring her into the clinic, provide an infusion of fluids and other medications to treat her symptoms. And most importantly, we can send her home to be with her family, and we don't have to interrupt her cancer treatment in any way. Now, this is clear why this is appealing to patients, but there are many reasons why our platform is going to appeal to oncologists. So we talked about that remote patient monitoring revenue. Today, oncologists are not able to tap into that reimbursement by providing a means of billing for remote patient monitoring. An average oncologist, as an individual practitioner, can start to bill upwards of $100,000 per year in additional revenue. And for those oncologists who have their productivity tracked through work RVUs, those are also credited with these remote patient monitoring codes. Of course, every oncologist wants the best outcomes for their patients, and we will be providing the means to improve quality of life and improve survival outcomes in their cancer patients, reducing emergency department utilization, which is going to be more and more important as those oncologists move towards value-based care models. And of course, any patient who has improved health-related quality of life is going to have better patient satisfaction scores for the people that are taking care of them. That's their oncology care team. So really, there are many, many reasons why oncologists are going to adopt this technology. And so that's why they will be our target customers as we move into commercialization. And so to summarize, our mission at Veris Health is to use technology, to use data to help patients and oncologists manage all of the risk associated with outpatient cancer treatment, start to bring more and more of that cancer treatment out of the hospital and into the home, and smooth that transition through every step of the cancer journey, which will ultimately benefit patients as well as every stakeholder in cancer care. And so with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Sunny Webb. We're extremely excited to have Sunny join the team officially starting this week. She brings a very rich background in tech as a Silicon Valley veteran. So Sunny, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Jimmy. I'm just so thrilled to join this really talented team. When I first read about Veris Health, I was impressed by their big vision to make a measurable impact on cancer care. And after speaking with them, I learned that they've really thought through how to empower oncologists to do what they already do better, support providers and payers to offer the best care possible at a lower cost, to help cancer patients gain deeper visibility into their own health, and to support their families in gaining an understanding of how their loved one is doing. So who am I? I cut my teeth in tech as a data scientist at the Department of Defense. And since, I've had a 15-year career in Silicon Valley leading software and engineering and product teams with some of the largest firms out there, including Accenture, Apple, Philips Healthcare, Disney, among others. I've been responsible for shipping over 50 products, building and leading global engineering product teams, and I've built technical strategies and led operations. I'm also the author on over 30 patents. So why Veris? Well, for one, like many of you, I've had people close to me that have battled cancer. And treatment has come a long way in recent years, but we can do better. I'm certain that Veris has the right approach and is developed by seasoned oncologists to build an integrated digital healthcare platform that will help millions of cancer patients and their oncologists. And as Jimmy just outlined, oncology is really just the beginning here. Second, I became a mom for the first time this past year. And every day since my daughter arrived, I think about how what I'm going to do today is going to impact the world that she inherits from us. So, data science and cutting edge technology is something that I'm quite comfortable with and that I've worked with and led for multiple enterprises. But applying data science to cancer care is a world changer for future generations. And Veris is the right team to make it a reality. I'm thrilled to join the Veris team as a CTO and work on building that vision together. So I'm excited to get going with Jimmy, Lishan, Tim, and the rest of the team here to make an important impact on the care. And together we have a really exciting road ahead. So now I'll just cover a few use cases. We have a really slick app that Jimmy just covered that's under development. We've got a really interesting and compelling platform that's going to bring it all together. But there's way more to it than just that. This is where value really comes into play, and what's perhaps the most important thing that we're here to discuss with you today. There's a few things that we highlighted already, but things like improving the individual patient outcomes and the quality of life is really the focus of what Veris is working on. We can think about things like lowering the health system cost and reducing hospitalization. So if we can look at a data lake and understand what potential possibilities exist in a population set of cancer patients, we can identify new risks and prevent future hospitalizations for those patients. We can look at utilizing real-time data and real-world data to even inform things like healthcare policy. And then down the road, thinking about the data-driven clinical trial design and real-time support is something that is quite important to us too. So just a few use cases to think about. Machine learning is always the buzzword here in Silicon Valley that everybody's talking about. But we can apply machine learning capabilities and image processing to things in cancer care, like determining if a photo submitted by a patient was a rash caused by something simple like poison ivy, or if it's a reaction to their prescribed treatment that a doctor needs to review immediately. An infectious rash is something that a doctor really has to dig into and deal with immediately, because if that is the case, then their immune system has likely been compromised. So we can use image processing to detect those types of scenarios. And then I've recently learned as well that weight loss is a common problem in cancer patients. So we can think about things like comparing photos of a face over time to detect major changes that could signify significant weight loss and other potential issues that they could work on with their physician. If we think about big data and analytics, the big headline here for families and physicians is Veris's capability to provide continuity of data. This allows physicians to quickly assess the probability of a major risk and then enable them to quickly respond to improve the overall quality of life for a patient. This is groundbreaking and quite revolutionary. So here's a few different examples that we shared with you here today. We have more to come, but just wanted to give you a sample. And we hope that you see as much potential here about the real impact as we do. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Sunny. Believe we're going to move on next to the Clinician's Corner, which is a video discussion between Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Shah.
To speak with Dr. Sumit Shah. Dr. Shah is an oncologist at Stanford, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know Dr. Shah recently as a colleague, as a fellow oncologist here in the Bay Area, but also as a technologist through our work at Veris Health. So Dr. Shah, welcome, and I'll give you a minute to introduce yourself before we jump into some questions.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. So my name is Samir Shah. I'm a medical oncologist at Stanford, and I do specialize in urologic cancers such as bladder cancer, prostate, kidney cancer, and testicular cancer. I focus on clinical trials within those cancers and also focus on digital health at Stanford. I'm a medical director for digital health for the hospital. So I've been involved in video visits as well as virtual second opinions and other remote technologies. So very excited to be here today and speak with you, Jimmy.
Great. And that expertise is certainly very relevant for what we're talking about today and what we're developing at Veris Health. And so, I wanted to start out with a topic I know you've been talking a lot about, and we've all been talking a lot about, and that is the experience of caring for patients during COVID. We all know that this has revolutionized a lot of our patient interactions, but I'm wondering if you can speak specifically about the cancer patients that you've been seeing and how that care experience has shifted during COVID, maybe how patients' expectations have changed. And then in a minute, we'll talk about some of your exciting research that you've been doing in COVID.
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy. So it's been an extraordinary year. Obviously, because of COVID, it's completely transformed not only the way that we deliver care, but also the type of care that we're actually giving patients. I remember at the early days of the pandemic, we actually canceled surgery for many patients. I even thought about not giving my patients curative intent chemotherapy because we worried about the dampening of the immune system that could take place that may put them at higher risk for COVID infection and subsequent sequelae of the disease. And so it's been extraordinary just in terms of the ability to actually give care is not only impacted, but also in terms of the type of care that we're actually giving patients. But in terms of healthcare delivery, we've seen a complete transformation in the way that we deliver care. And that's obviously changed patient expectations. So most tangibly, what we've seen is we've seen a meteoric rise in the use of telemedicine or video visits. So as a digital health medical director, I've actually been waving the flag for video visits for the last 5 years. And I got about 2% utilization rate of video visits amongst my faculty. And then March 17th, when shelter in place went into effect in 2020, we went from 2% to 80% overnight in terms of utilization of video visits. So it's been a meteoric rise, and I think it's here to stay as well. I don't think we'll be going back to the old system that we did before, and that's largely because I think of the 3 Ps. Patients actually want it, providers definitely want it, and now the most important P is payers. payers actually have kind of laid out the new landscape for how to reimburse for video visits. And so now we have parity of reimbursement between video visits and in-person visits because of CMS restrictions that were lifted during this last pandemic. So I think it's here to stay. I think the patients now expect to see their physician at least some percentage of the time via video, and they find it very convenient. And a lot of patients wonder, why weren't we doing this, 10, 15 years ago? Because we've had the technology for such a long time.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and certainly, I've seen the same changes in my own practice experience, more in the community setting than the academic setting. So I do think that this has really permeated all aspects of healthcare delivery. Now, I know you've been involved in some major research in cancer care during COVID, some national coalitions working at these research projects and published some groundbreaking papers in journals like The Lancet. So tell us a little bit about what you've learned from that research.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. So I've been leading Stanford's efforts in collaborating with an international consortium. It's actually an idea that took off of Twitter, believe it or not,
Wow.
of one oncologist saying, hey, we should get all our data together to create a database of COVID-positive patients who have cancer. And because of that, now we have several hundred institutions from all across the world contributing about over 15,000 patients who are COVID positive and have cancer. And we can see different outcomes amongst those patients and then look at different risk factors to see which patients are at highest risk for severe COVID or increased risk of mortality. And the results of these types of studies are unfortunately quite humbling. What we know is that COVID has a very high association with mortality amongst cancer patients. And we also know that that risk is not on par with all cancers. It's not an equal playing field, unfortunately. What we see is that certain cancers are associated with higher risk of mortality than others. So for instance, in general, I would say that a cancer diagnosis with COVID positivity would lead to a 10 times higher risk of mortality compared to the general population, which is quite humbling. In addition to that, we know that certain cancers such as lung cancer or blood cancer such as leukemia or lymphoma are also a very high risk, up to a 30% risk of mortality with COVID. So those types of numbers are quite staggering and has obviously led us to change the way that we practice medicine and deliver care for these patients.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated by the fact that some of this ideation came from using Twitter, and so I'm curious, if you've learned in your research or just kind of in your own, thinking about that in your own practice. Did you learn about challenges that new technology could address?
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy. I think, for one is that, as we discussed before, patients were very afraid to come into the hospital setting or even the clinic setting. So they were weighing their options about whether to take the risk with their cancer or to weigh the risk of potentially impairing their immune system and potentially contracting COVID. So that risk benefit was very difficult for patients to take on by themselves. So it was really important that we made patients feel very safe in the healthcare environment. And so, things like video visits were very important to allow patients to be in their home. We also did virtual second opinions. So if a patient was in Nebraska and has a rare tumor, they don't have to come out all the way to San Francisco or Boston to see a specialist in that field. They can actually get an expert second opinion from their living room. We also enabled the virtual rounding so that physicians, a lot of elderly physicians actually were very hesitant to even come into the hospital to see patients, given the risk that was a little bit unknown in the early days of the pandemic. So we actually were able to employ virtual rounding. Can you actually have physicians, go into the hospital virtually to see their patients as opposed to actually physically enter the premises? So I think those things were all very important and things that we learned. But we also know that there was a huge push towards remote patient monitoring because of COVID. Are there better ways that we can actually see how patients are doing outside the healthcare system if they're only going to be inside the healthcare system for a few minutes per year, essentially, compared to the number of hours they're going to be outside the healthcare system? And so there was a huge emphasis on remote patient monitoring because of COVID, and I think it's really accelerated that.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect move into the next topic that I was going to bring up, which is that question of remote patient monitoring in cancer patients. We have seen, reimbursement come out to support remote patient monitoring. There are a lot of technologies out there. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on, what is the role for remote patient monitoring in cancer patients? What do you see as the desire or the need from the healthcare systems? And then what limitations do you see in some of the existing technologies that are out there?
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy. So one thing I'll say, just to comment on the current system that we have right now. So we know that care currently in 2021, for the most part, is very episodic. When a patient comes to see me, they see me in clinic or they see you in clinic probably every 3 to 4 weeks. If not, some patients with prostate cancer, for instance, I'll see every 3 months. And when you see that patient with prostate cancer in front of you, and you ask him, how you've been since the last time I saw you, most likely that patient will be like, I'm fine. And then their spouse will look at them with an angry eye and say, no, you haven't been fine. Like you've been, having nausea, you've had weight loss, you're not eating anything anymore, you've had diarrhea, you have all these symptoms. But what we found, Jimmy, in a lot of our research shows that physicians actually only get about half the symptoms that patients actually have during a clinic visit. That could be one, because of limited time that we have with the patient, or two, that the patient just forgets and there's a recall bias. They may be so focused on their scan or whether they're responding to treatment, they may not tell you about all those complications that may have arisen over the last several weeks or months. So that's the current system that we have, but obviously we would like to do much better than that. So what we know is that if we have remote patient monitoring systems in place, we can have a more proactive and personalized solution to actually monitor patients in real time. So, we're very excited by this technology, and I would say that it is, I think, very interesting in oncology because we actually have some evidence for it. Right now, I think it's still the very, very early days of RPM, remote patient monitoring, and the use cases are kind of few and far between, and largely because there's not a whole lot of data yet for RPM. And I think that's what everyone's looking for, are outcome differences. Because we can do a lot of fancy things these days. We can measure someone's heart rate and their temperature and their O2 sat, but does that actually translate into meaningful change for that patient? Or in a lot of fields, like primary care, that'd be very difficult to prove that. But oncology, we actually have proven that already, which makes oncology, I think, a terrific use case for RPM. So what we know right now is back in the biggest study that has been done in this field was back in 2017 with Ethan Bosch's group in Memorial Sloan Kettering. And what they did is they randomized about 700 patients with stage 4 cancer to either the usual care, the episodic care that I just discussed, or a separate platform where patients every week had the opportunity to engage in a web-based portal where they can just report their symptoms. And if there are any abnormalities in those symptoms, a nurse would reach out to them and offer potentially an intervention. So nothing earth-shattering by any means. And this is 2017. The technology wasn't even that great. It's probably some Netscape browser that they're using, and just typing in their symptoms essentially. But the results of that study were quite startling, even though the technology was actually pretty low-tech intervention. What we know from that study is that for the patients who were randomized to this web-based platform, not only did they have improved quality of life, which kind of makes sense if you're able to improve their symptoms, but we also saw decreased healthcare utilization. So we saw that patients who were randomized to that arm actually had decreased emergency room visits, which is a huge win for the the healthcare system in general. And the third most interesting thing, Jimmy, that I think would shock a lot of folks is that it actually improved overall survival.
Right.
So by patients having access to this web-based portal, you actually improved overall survival by 5 months, which is, at least in my world and in your world, it's pretty extraordinary. If you had a pill that would prolong prostate cancer survival by 5 months, it'd be on the cover of the New England Journal. It'd be it'd be a billion-dollar blockbuster drug. So the 5 months, but just having this, just changing the way that we deliver care is incredibly meaningful. So that was, really exciting, and it's kind of pushed us into thinking, how do we actually institutionalize RPM now in the oncology space? So I think that's where things are going now. So yeah, quite excited by this area though.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for that great summary and enlightening discussion about the BASH study, which I've always been amazed by the outcomes that they showed there. What really kind of touched me about that study was that they used technology to really enhance the physician-patient relationship and the physician-nurse relationship. And that enhancement of that relationship had a bigger impact than a lot of the drugs that we use. So really, really promising for the future. And, so we talked about that study and some of the systems out there that focus really on symptom reporting, which is obviously critical in cancer patients. But you also touched on monitoring some physiologic parameters. And I know there's a lot less data out there looking at those specific parameters, but I think that there's a lot of promise in technology that enables tracking of physiology. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what additional value that can bring if you can detect early fevers and early rapid heart rates, and if there's any technology out there today that does this in a reliable way that patients can adhere to for many, many months of cancer treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Jimmy. What I'll say is that the technology out there, I would say largely is focused on questionnaires. So we're sending out these what we call PROs or patient-reported outcomes to patients on a cadence every 1, 2, 3 weeks. And I would say that that's largely subjective data, which obviously is very important. Credit to that Bosch study that I just mentioned, and that's exactly what they did. But you would imagine that you can get so much more granular data if you're able to add on objective data on top of that. Patient may not understand or realize that they're dehydrated. That's a very patients don't know how to describe what dehydration feels like.
Right.
But what does your heart rate change? Yes, it does. Does your just even like your physiologic parameters within your body change? And that is data that we can objectively say in the hospital setting, for instance, I can tell you if a patient's dehydrated or not. But whether they would be able to do that in the clinic or on a questionnaire is probably much more unclear. So when you're able to couple that information about subjective data from the patient about how they're feeling, but also with objective data from actual vital signs, I think that you have a very powerful platform at that point. For instance, one of the most dreaded complications that we have in oncology is neutropenic fever. So when I offer chemotherapy to a patient, it dampens their immune system, and now they're at increased risk or susceptibility to infection. And if they were to spike a fever when they had low blood counts or a lower immune system, we know the mortality rate for that type of infection is very high, unfortunately. So all of these patients have to go to the emergency room, and they have to have their labs checked, and we have to administer, antibiotics right away. In each one of those hospitalizations for neutropenic fever, by the way, costs on average $50,000, and that's around the country. I can only imagine here in the Bay Area how much it costs. Right. But if we were able to prevent that, that is such a huge win for that patient and a huge win for the healthcare system in general. Right? None of our patients actually want to go to the emergency room, especially in this era of COVID. If you have neutropenic fever and if you're immunosuppressed, the last thing you want to do is stand in line next to a patient who's being ruled out for COVID, right? Or a parent with their 2-year-old kid who's sneezing all over. And so, if we could use this type of technology to help prevent those visits, ED visits in particular, and readmissions, I think that's a huge win for our healthcare system. So I think the physiologic data needs to be combined with subjective data to make it more powerful.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit and touch on a new topic, which is the possibility of bringing cancer care into the home. Today, patients go to typically an outpatient center where they can undergo infusions of chemotherapy, undergo radiation therapy. And so I'm curious if you see a future where some of that treatment can come into the home, and what technology would be required to enable that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jimmy. And I personally see this as the future of oncology right here. I think that over the next decade, we're going to see that hospital capacity is going to be going down considerably as all care, not just oncology, but is really moving outside of the hospital. into the home. And that's largely because one, patients want that. It's much more convenient for patients. Two is that our therapeutics are kind of going in that direction as well. Before we used to have these 6-hour infusions that you'd have to sit in a chair for 6 hours a day to get your chemotherapy. For
Right.
one, we're seeing less and less chemotherapy being used and more of these, shorter immunotherapies and targeted-based therapies that are very different. But not only are our IV infusions getting shorter, but we're also transitioning from just IV therapies to really oral therapies. And now we're starting to see subcutaneous therapy,
Right.
where a patient can actually inject what used to be a 2-hour rituximab infusion, for instance, for lymphoma, can now just inject it within their skin within 15 minutes, which is really remarkable. So the types of therapies that we're giving patients are changing dramatically. And then the last thing I'll say about why this change probably will happen is I think that insurance will eventually be driving this even more so than what oncologists themselves want. And the reason is, Jimmy, it takes a tremendous amount of resources and money to actually hang one of these IV therapies in like a tertiary care cancer center, infusion center that's attached to a hospital. I mean, the markup on that is extraordinary. There's so much overhead costs on top of that. So an IV infusion, for instance, for a single immunotherapy may be a $50,000 infusion. And ultimately, a patient may not mind that as well as long as their insurance is paying for it. But what we're already starting to see is that insurance companies now are unwilling to pay for this. They say, why are we spending $50,000 on an IV infusion at a tertiary care center when we can just do a home infusion with a home nurse and deliver it for potentially hundreds of dollars through a subspecialty pharmacy that they're contracted with. So I think because of all those reasons that we'll see a shift largely coming from payers, that we'll have to see it going to the home. But the technology that we'll have to have is, again, obviously video visits to be able to monitor patients. But then two is, again, that whole remote patient monitoring, though, not only with subjective symptoms, but this is really where the vital signs and the physiologic data come into hand, because that's the data that I would have if the patient were right in front of me in the clinic. And then you have other things like, so in theory, you have a video visit with your physician. The physician says that you're doing well. They can actually see your data for the last 3 months about how you've been feeling. I can see your physiologic data in terms of your heart rate, your blood pressure, your other vital signs, make sure that you're feeling well. And then I can give you the okay, to give yourself the injection. And you can even imagine things like digital safety locks, where I press a green button and say, okay, now you can deliver yourself your subcutaneous injection. And I think all those things are probably in the works as well. So I think it's a very bright future ahead, but I certainly agree with you that this is where oncology care is going.
Yeah, great. Well, Sumit, it's always a pleasure to talk. Congratulations on all of your amazing work and for keeping Stanford really at the forefront, not just during COVID, but as we come out of this time of COVID and take what we've learned and use that to make cancer care better for the long term. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. It's really been a pleasure.
Apologize for that. So I just wanted to say that was great. And it was really great to hear two accomplished, compassionate clinicians talk about the status of the specialty, the support specialty of oncology, and where it's heading in the future. I was also pointing out that we're hoping that Dr. Shah will actually be able to join us live for the Q&A session. He's doing what he's supposed to do right now, which is taking care of patients in clinic. So we're going to move on to the panel discussion, a bit of a roundtable, and I'm going to basically pepper my colleagues here with some questions for some deep insights into some of the deeper insights into some of the things we've been talking about. So I'm going to start with Tim Baxter. Tim, you spent your entire career as a technology executive at major international companies such as AT&T and Sony, and most recently as CEO of Samsung North America, and you've witnessed firsthand how technology has revolutionized that industry. What are some of the most important lessons that you think you bring from that experience to Veris and the area of digital health?
Well, first of all, LeSean, thank you for having me. Really excited to be able to participate here. I think there's, as I think about it, in my 30-some years in the tech space, it's really been about establishing formats And I think it's relevant for what we're talking about here. Formats like high definition TV or smart TV, streaming, and 5G as examples of that. Building out ecosystems. And a lot of what I heard in that prior session was doing some of that, right, in the healthcare space, both payers as well as patients and the practitioners. I think help navigate the shift from analog to digital. Or moving from these products that we would call discrete, some might say dumb products, to now smart devices and smart solutions. And what's interesting, most of that 35 years in doing that, I used to use and coin a phrase called convergence. Now it's a much more sexier term, calling it connected intelligence or smart devices. But the interesting thing about it is the growth that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years has been remarkable. And that growth has been driven by a host of new technologies. We've talked about some of those, right? It's AI, it's big data, it's cloud, it's 5G, IoT, VR, AR are all new enablers that are creating these exciting experiences. And when you combine that new technology with relevant data, with a simple UI, you're now creating new applications, new platforms. We're creating new possibilities, and in some cases, disrupting old. So I think it's the combination of those that is one of the key lessons that I take away from this. Number one. Number two, I'm really excited about where battery technology is beginning to go. And I think that's relevant for Veris and what the types of products that we're bringing to market. But we see on the horizon solutions that will provide new form factors, longer battery life, right? Quicker charging, greater capabilities. And I think that's another big opportunity as we look at technologies coming down the road. And I say that, LaShawn, because if you think about Veris, it's fundamentally a healthcare-oriented tech platform that uses smart devices, right? And most of my career has been around platform and smart devices. And we're already using cloud, software and hardware, smart devices, and a slick UI, right? So the key building blocks of that are already in place. And I think if we look down where things like smart cities are moving, IoT, the smart home, I think all of those technologies and solutions will only be tools that will help us, enable us to move quicker, because it is smaller processors, it is sensors and everything built in with 5G that are going to create new experiences that I think Veris is in a position to take advantage of.
That's great. I actually want to dive into one of the points you made, which is establishing formats, building ecosystems, and sort of setting standards, right? So, Jimmy and I know as physicians that there's always been just an incredible frustration that healthcare has been so far behind. I mean, if you think about electronic medical records, I left practice just as they were coming on about 10 years ago, and just basic keeping track of, just the flow of information about what's happening to a patient as they move through the system. 15 years ago was predominantly done through handwritten notes, which is mind-boggling considering how long all other major sectors have moved there. And, we represent 20%, as I mentioned earlier, of the entire economy. So it's exciting that things are now starting to change, and obviously on the information technology side, that's moving forward, and electronic medical records have established a foothold. But one of the things that the whole notion of standards and sort of an advantage of being first to market, and establishing yourself as in a sense as a default or one of a handful of defaults is really important. I think if you look at the electronic medical records, they eventually coalesced into 2 or 3 companies that dominate the space. You might argue, are they the best? Are they not the best? It's I think, like you said, the VHS versus Betamax argument on format. So perhaps maybe you have some additional insights on that narrower point of entering this space now of smart devices, and collection of physiologic data with wireless communications, and advantages that Veris might have about being early, entering that, and being pretty early, and entry into that market?
Yeah, sure. No, I think there's a couple ways we can go with that. I think first on the ecosystem piece of it and building that, it is heavy lifting. And there are so many different players in the value chain, and all have different things that they're trying to accomplish, or in some cases protect, right? And I think healthcare can be looked at in the same way that content, hardware, operating systems, and others. I like to use the analogy of tech industry as sort of a reflection of the world. It's getting more and more complex. It's not getting simpler, right? And if I think about the mobile phone industry as a small example of that, a decade ago it was very neatly understood in terms of the value chain participants. Hardware people made phones, right? Operating systems connected those phones to the carriers, who are the other third part of the wheel of that. And everybody sort of stayed within its knitting, if you will, in that space. Well, the world has changed. Now you have the operating system guys developing hardware. You've got hardware developing services and solution. You've got carriers getting into other services. So it's much more complex than ever before. And while that can be daunting on one level, I think it's quite exciting on the other, because while those lines get blurred a little bit, there's opportunities for new partnerships in strange ways, right? The term frenemies is more and more common, and I live with it. I actually had at Samsung, I was running a $30 billion business in the US, but my biggest competitor in North America was Apple. Samsung's biggest customer globally was Apple, right? How do you navigate that complexity? Or Google, who ran the operating systems for it, but also sold that works, but we're also selling their own products. So I think it underscores the complexity of managing that, but it really presents the opportunity to, first of all, embrace that complexity, embrace the frenemies, embrace the new opportunities that come about that, number one. The other point I'd mention on that is, if you look at every single big tech company right now, they have all announced or are executing or have aspirations in healthcare. Every single one of them, right? You've got the hardware folks that are leveraging their billions of devices and their apps to introduce consumers to wellness and other solutions. You've got infrastructure folks like IBM and Microsoft doing really good work associated with cloud and digital data. Google and Facebook leveraging data for outcomes, even Amazon in that space. And so you can look at that and say, wow, they're all threats to what we're trying to do. But in reality, a lot of them are focused on what I'll call infrastructure plumbing for digital healthcare or general healthcare solutions. Whereas PAVmed, Veris, Lucid were very focused on discrete applications that can live within that area. And if you combine then big tech and the exciting things that are going in the startup wellness space, the opportunities for partnerships, I think, are pretty limitless for us. And it's an exciting time.
I'm glad you transitioned to that, because that was going to be the next thing I was going to flesh on, because, people wonder, a smaller company like us, and Veris obviously as a startup within a smaller company, what is the competition going to be from these larger companies? And I think you nailed it, and Jimmy and Sunny, please chime in as well, which is that, healthcare is hard. And there are specific and unique aspects of medical tech devices and actual the therapeutic and diagnostic side of healthcare. And we learned that it's not as easy as it sometimes sounds to do blood tests in a little tube, right? So the fact is that these larger companies, as Jimmy had said, are building sort of the highway, but I'm not, and certainly they're looking to do consumer-oriented products with wearables and others that can facilitate in sort of the digital therapeutic side of things. But we feel like there is a lot of room to work with them as enablers, but not necessarily as competition. I don't know, maybe Jimmy and Sunny, if you guys have some additional insights on that from us as our two representatives from the Bay Area.
Yeah, I'll go first. I absolutely agree with that. I think that, the Microsofts of the world, are building the highways, but the federal government is actually a big driving force behind a lot of this change as well. The 21st Century Cures Act opened the door to interoperability and data sharing and broke down a lot of the barriers that were there. And so, I think when you look at what the infrastructure Microsoft and the similar companies are building, the push from the federal government to keep data flowing and really prevent these walled off gardens that we saw in the past. It's very exciting for the opportunities that come up for companies like Veris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just adding to that, just really putting the kind of the finer point on that building the highways. In the past, technology companies like the ones we've been talking about here today have been thinking about things like, how do we digitize records? How do we take what we're doing today and just move it into the digital, right? And how do we consolidate data, and how do we standardize processes? A lot of what Jimmy was talking about. Currently there's a big effort and a lot of energy being put into things like, how do we take devices and make them mobile? How do we take them out into the field, like a mobile ultrasound device? I've spent some time in my career actually working on solving some of the problems that are going on with mobile medical devices, and how do we allow physicians to work with those in a hands-free context. But some of the really interesting technologies going forward that we're thinking about, it's groundbreaking even for us here at Veris, are they're not that groundbreaking, to be honest. In some ways, Bluetooth has a brand new protocol that is out. It's already being used, Bluetooth 5.2. I was geeking out recently with Jimmy about it, but it offers a lot more advanced communication. You can sync with multiple devices. It's a lot faster than what we have today. It's not in every device that we have today, because a lot of the big players we've been talking about, like Apple and Samsung, are building it into their devices today. And so there's a lot on the horizon that we can start building and thinking about, even where we stand at this point.
Maybe it is an advantage that we're entering a little bit later in the life cycle of these technologies, because we have better Bluetooth, we have better batteries, we have other things that allow us to create these products and make them small and manageable and easily implantable and so forth. So I think that's great. I think I'll just use this opportunity again to emphasize to make that distinction that I made at the beginning about, we are taking existing paradigms of clinical care. We're not creating an app that someone can sort of, use to help them feel better about, manage their own diabetes better. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's a very different business model. It's not building upon existing paradigms with facilities, which is where the money is, where all the money is flowing in healthcare. The 20% of the economy is going towards that, to paying hospitals, providers, to care for patients within certain paradigms, and modernizing those and using these exciting tools. We think carries a more predictable and more, we think in the long run, more valuable business model than trying to see how many hours a day you can have your patient sort of interacting with your nutritional system or your other care element there. Let's move on to that. That was great. Let's move on to maybe if I can ask you, Jimmy. Tim had talked about platform technologies and the importance of platform technologies, and we absolutely, although we're starting and focusing initially on cancer care, we do see this as a platform technology that has other applications. And you sort of mentioned them, but I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to do a bit more in depth on some of the things we're working on and plans we have in heart failure and kidney failure and in potentially other applications as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the application in cancer care is very clear, and it makes sense for that to be the first market that we enter. But there are a lot of other diseases out there, a lot of sick patients that have a similar paradigm where they're getting outpatient care. They're at high risk of complications. They end up in the hospital all the time. But there are a handful of very specific parameters that if we had real-time information on, we could actively manage and prevent a lot of those complications. So we touched on cardiovascular diseases. I think CHF is a great paradigm to look at because there's a long history of research in congestive heart failure. And there are devices that have been developed over the years to help provide some of that early warning system, but these are severely limited in their application. There are some implanted devices that require a lot of labor on the patient side to get even still small snapshots in time of what is like the pulmonary artery pressure, which is a marker of severity of someone's CHF. So again, leveraging all this technology that we've been talking about building in this platform into a combined kind of data gathering device and software and analytics solution that can capture a suite of physiologic parameters in real time, have uninterrupted data, and really show the nuances of physiology change over time would revolutionize the way cardiologists take care of CHF patients.
Yeah.
End-stage renal disease, similarly, patients that are getting outpatient care, that have a high risk of complications, end up in the hospital all the time, and have devices in place for vascular access, for the exchange of blood that's required for hemodialysis. And so, again, leveraging the platform technology that we're building to look at those parameters that are specific to those hemodialysis patients can save the overall health system a lot in terms of money and resources. There's a huge push on the government side, on Medicare side, to move dialysis into the home. And you're never going to do that if you can't monitor patients while you're doing the dialysis.
Just wanted to pinpoint one of them you mentioned because it's sort of true to my heart as a former heart surgeon. Just to flesh it out a little bit, which is monitoring of pulmonary artery pressures, which is an important, very useful indicator. And this is a good example of why maybe we're coming in at the right time, because the CardioMEMS device, which was leveraging micro electronics and mechanical systems, I believe that CardioMEMS device launched 10 years ago, maybe not quite, by St. Jude. It's now within Abbott. But because of the limitations of battery technology, it was a passive device that had to be interrogated. So you were not getting continuous data. And so you had to go in and actually, the patient had to put the device on and measure a spot measurement. Spot measurements are never as good as continuous data because you don't follow trends. And anytime you're asking the patient to contribute to the collection of the data, you're going to have difficulty with compliance and so forth. So what's really exciting that we've sort of entered this period of time where the technology is such that we will be able to provide continuous data. So anywhere we go, whether it's measuring temperature or central venous pressure, or eventually when we end up in the cardiac space, all of that data will be continuous data. Now, it may be transmitting, with, again, as Sunny said, Bluetooth is getting lower and lower power. It may be transmitting intermittently, but it's collecting it continuously. So the physician will have all that data. And Tim, you've talked about how platforms expand opportunities and sort of embody and empower. I thought maybe you might just chime in about the whole notion of using platform technologies to expand and empower.
Yeah, I think the piece that I think is so interesting about this, and I think what's obviously clear is I'm not a medical expert. I've come from the business and technology space. But what I'm really excited about is not only where PAVmed is going and moving more and more towards what I call smart med tech solutions, but what Jimmy and the team are building out in terms of this digital health platform. And he touched upon where the extensions are that exist in other clinical uses. The way I tend to think about it is we can take this platform, and that's why it's important to establish it first in cancer care, into a host of different other areas. And the lens that I tend to think about associated with evaluating these are, where can we empower patients, right? Where can we identify early detection opportunities? How do we leverage real-time information, not just for the patient, but for the patient care team, real-time quickly? How do you reduce those ER visits? How do you improve the quality of life? And thereby, how do we drive cost out of the system? And I think by applying that type of lens to this, I think that we will find significant amount of opportunities to take advantage of this platform and use it. And Sonny, the notion of rinse and repeat, is a common notion, and I think it's very relevant here as we build that platform. I think we can use this in a number of different exciting ways. That, as you said earlier, we're not creating new applications. We are fixing and improving and enhancing existing care solutions, and I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, thanks, Tim. So, I'm going to actually move on to Sunny. So, there's a lot of hype around AI and machine learning, and it seems like everybody just sort of slaps that, ML, AI, anytime you have an acronym like that on anything. And we see it in healthcare every day. We get the newsletters of sort of what's going on in the medtech industry, and it seems like every company, no matter what they're doing, is trying to sort of, use that. So how should investors cut through some of the hype around AI, machine learning, even terms like big data, and understand the real value of these tools and data analytics in general, and sort of with regard to some of the things we're looking forward to working on?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, and here in Silicon Valley, you see it on everything. It's like you've got an AI salad almost if you want to find it. But artificial intelligence is a really, really powerful tool, but it's not a magic box. And I think as an investor, you can avoid the buzz and the fluff of AI by finding a company that's really hyper-focused on solving a really important problem. So those are the two keys, right? Hyper-focused and important problem. You start by asking the question, really, what does this solve? Who is the audience that this is going to impact? And how important is this problem? There's a lot of chatbots out there, but and I don't mean to diminish that by any stretch. I have a lot of friends here who are working on those things. But one example is we as a society have been hearing and reading a lot about autonomous vehicles for years and years. We keep hearing that it's around the corner, reading it's around the corner. Here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of, fleets driving around, almost on every corner where you see an autonomous driving vehicle, but we're still not there. We still have a long ways to go. So the important part is really focusing on those questions that I mentioned. What is the problem? How important is it? Who is it impacting? And here at Veris, what we're working on is quite hyper-focused. We've walked through a lot of that material and talked about it here today. And it's using advanced but not impossible technologies. They already exist. There's nothing here that's highly experimental, and it's solving a quite important problem. So I think those are some good ways to think about cutting through the buzz and the AI. Fluff that's out there. Because
it's mature, right? I mean, AI and ML algorithms are quite mature, and if you feed it good data, obviously, crap in, crap out. But if you feed it good data, and one of the things that we're going to be generating is gobs and gobs of data, and if you feed it high quality data and you can correlate it with certain real clinical outcomes and clinical events and clinical symptom reporting and so forth, that to me seems like in many ways the ideal way to be able to the kind of sort of the data structures that you can use to feed these well-established, mature algorithms that allow you to identify patterns and learn from them and basically be able to provide better care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So let's move on to the business model. I know Jimmy had that slide that showed that fact that this is again, this is one of the things, as when we were talking before we acquired Oncodis, the sort of the light bulb went off when I saw that a previous version of that slide as to how there's an opportunity here to create a business model that's not based on sort of traditional slogging it out on the reimbursement realm with Medicare and private payers and so forth. And it's quite, and we vetted that, as quite extensively before making the acquisition. And one of the things that I thought was quite creative and struck me, and the thing that you avoid with this is, devices that are common, that have been around for a while, such as ports, have become commoditized, right? So which port, a particular, I'm sure you would concur in your experience, which port you happen to use is no longer in the decision tree of the physician. It's what's bundled with some particular package, either at your hospital or more increasingly at your IDN or your group purchasing organization and so forth. And it's all commoditized. And so when you look at this initially without the business model that you developed and say, well, okay, we have clearly a better port, right, that does all sorts of cool things and adds value to the care of the patient, we should be entitled to get paid more for that. That's a very heavy lift. And then we've seen that in other less invasive technologies, other new technologies. It's not that you can't get it done. It's a lot of, so it can be a slog both on the reimbursement side and also just making the case to the facilities that they should be paying more for something that has modern new technologies. And what's great about this model is we bypass all that we're not going to the care center and we're not asking them to pay us more for their port. We're actually giving them the port or selling them the port at the same cost as they would a dumb port, as Tim would call it, right? So maybe if you could just talk a bit more about how that looks from an oncology practice point of view or a cancer care center, and then some of the other aspects of this beyond the remote care and the revenue from the implantation with the care models and never events and value-based care, things like that.
Right, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that by providing a platform and a service, we avoid that battle to the bottom that goes on in the device industry for pricing. And we're truly providing value. But the unique aspect of our platform is that we have those existing reimbursement codes to leverage out of the gates. And so we could start selling tomorrow. We can leverage these existing codes, the implantation codes, the remote patient monitoring codes, but still set up the vast majority of our revenue as a service recurring revenue model. And by selling directly to the oncologists, again, we're selling directly to the decision makers in a cancer program, not selling to the buyers or the GPOs, like you mentioned. That alone, even under the existing framework, that alone is a $2 to $3 billion market in the United States. And then, of course, the rest of the world is out there. But if we look a little bit more about what are the trends in healthcare and what are the trends in cancer care, and how can we leverage that value creation in the future, we are shifting more towards value-based care. Medicare has what they call the oncology care model, where risk is shared between Medicare and the practice delivering the treatment. There's a similar program among private payers called the Oncology Medical Home. And Medicare is also rolling out their alternative payment models for cancer care, where there's almost like a capitated payment for an episode of care. And so within that framework, it's going to be critical that the deliverers of the healthcare, the doctors, the hospitals, that they are managing their own costs and their own expenses. If they do this well, then they stand to probably do better under those systems financially than they are in traditional fee-for-service. But if they're not doing well, patients are having a lot of hospitalizations. One hospital admission to the ICU can blow up the entire financial model for a practice that's in value-based care. And so we know that practices that are currently enrolled in the oncology care model are looking for technology and instituting programs that have an upfront cost, but are ultimately saving big dollar value on the back end by preventing these hospitalizations and moving care into the home. And by doing that, they then ultimately reap the financial benefits of higher payments and bonuses that come from Medicare or from private payers, and then ultimately better contracts with those payers down the road. So as we move in that direction, this technology that we're building is going to become a must-have for all practices.
You mentioned that they start off with that they're willing to pay a cost up front, but what's again amazing about the math here is that their net cost is actually not positive, right? Because they're getting reimbursed for the device implantation, they're going to get reimbursed for the patient monitoring, so they're already being reimbursed, and yes, they're paying the subscription, but that subscription is already covered by their baseline reimbursements within the baseline sort of fee-for-service structure. And then if you include the incentives and bonuses, those are really on top of that. Tim, this kind of reminded, again, another example of, that the tech industry has moved to subscription models for software and for other things for a long time. This just seems to be, another example of us sort of coming around to things that have been well honed in the technology sector. I thought maybe you might comment on that. I assume you had some experience, at least in the latter years, at Samsung for that.
Sure. Well, what's interesting about it, and as Jimmy was describing it, I was thinking back. It actually goes back really a lot longer, decades ago. I mean, think about, and a doctor's offices are great. Everybody had a printer, right? You didn't buy necessarily the printer. It was a managed service, right? You basically paid a monthly fee for somebody, and when it was a problem, they took it out and they replaced it. And so that notion of managed services, right? And now it has a much sexier term in SaaS or other related capabilities. And surely, the mobile phone industry was built off of that for decades. Right? People thought they actually paid $200 for this phone, but or they thought the phone cost $200, but it was lumped in with a service and hardware solution, just the same way razor and razor blade concepts emerged on that. So I think it surely has gotten more sophisticated in the IT space around seats. And I think that is a very common approach to it. And having multiple business model options is attractive because you can really design it to the needs of the audience, whether it's a large scale hospital or whether it's a doctor's office or something in between. So having that flexibility, and I think it's great to see the healthcare industry embracing that, because I think too there are different ways to solve pain points in the industry, and this is just another one. And being creative on it is front and center.
Great. I want to leave enough time for questions, so I thought maybe we would close out on a discussion around data. So maybe I'll start with you, Sonny. Companies like Livongo and others have garnered large valuations based on data monetization. And sometimes the notion of data monetization comes, well, I guess maybe even more often than not, comes with a negative implication that you're selling the data. There's privacy issues and all that. So I guess really two questions. Maybe you could start with how do we actually value data? I mean, how do we think about, okay, we have this terabytes of data or more. We have the analytic tools that you're going to help us build to extract that, and then we're going to go to payers and pharmaceutical companies and others and claim that there's value in that. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you think about that.
Yeah, happy to. When I think about data monetization, it's quite a popular term, but when I'm trying to, maybe explain it to my mom, it's something along the lines of, if we have all of this data, we can then extract probability of good things happening and perhaps risks happening. And from that, we can take and figure out what are the services that we could offer to build around those types of calculations and that probability. So that's sort of mid-level and from a technical perspective, but we're not taking data perhaps and selling it or trying to put a quantified number on how much each binary digit is worth, but really thinking about how do we take data and then extrapolate it into something meaningful, and then how do we build services around it to be able to help the people who are affected by it. So, we're thinking about the stakeholders that are involved. Today, we've been talking a lot about the patients, the oncologists, and providers and payers, and thinking about how data that's collected can then be useful for them portrayed in the right way.
Yep.
So that's how I would.
So we're not selling ads, right? We're not using data for
not selling
all
ads.
sorts of nefarious reasons that people are having to testify in front of Congress over. This is the identifiable data is going to the care provider, right? And the broader data is really population-based data that has, that's not identifiable, that allows us to identify patterns and learn things about the what works and what doesn't work with care. Jimmy, do you want to maybe elaborate on some of the privacy aspects of that as we wrap up here?
Sure. So, there are very clear standards put out by the federal government, by FDA, from other standards organizations on how you manage data privacy in healthcare. And so it's very clear roadmap of how this is done and how that data can be exchanged between parties, between the care delivery system, their business partners, and the federal government. And so, fortunately, the Microsofts and Amazons of the world that are building that infrastructure that we've talked about, this is a critical component of those cloud computing platforms that they're building. And so there's a roadmap and an infrastructure in place. And so we have a very clear pathway ahead for how we manage that, how we comply, but most importantly, how do we live up to the spirit of that to protect patients while also moving medicine forward.
Yeah, I think that's one area perhaps where healthcare has been a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of standardizing processes for protecting privacy and not having to slog through a 20-page terms, privacy, notice that you have to click to accept to use the technology. So that's really not where we're going to be. All right, we have 15 minutes left. So I think I definitely want to save enough time to answer questions. And I think from the count here, I think we may, if our operators here can bring in Dr. Shah if he's here, and then we can move to questions hey, there he is. Hi, Dr. Shah.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Actually, while we're waiting for the question, the Q&A to sort of fill up the pipeline, I did want to ask you one thing which didn't come up in your conversation with Dr. Mitchell, which is I know you've worked closely with the pharmaceutical industry on the use of digital technologies in their aspect of the business, and I was curious if you might have some insights from that and how that might inform some of the things that we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that pharmaceuticals are very interested in this space for, as I talked about in that prior trial, are there quality improvement outcomes in terms of quality of life? There's a decrease in healthcare utilization, but the improved overall survival was thought to be one of three possibilities in terms of the conjecture as why this intervention actually led to an overall survival. And probably the one that is most intriguing for pharmaceuticals is that we were able to show that patients actually stayed on their drug longer. So there was better adherence to medication because of better symptom monitoring. And so for pharmaceuticals, that's a big thing for them. If they can continue patients on their drugs for longer, that obviously is to their benefit and also to the patient's benefit, as been shown with overall survival. So they have a very vested interest in understanding how their patients take their medications, what leads to compliance issues. And so physiologic data like that we're providing through this platform would be very helpful for them.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. So let's go to some questions here. I'm just going to basically take them in order and sort of relevance to the topic at hand here. So maybe, Jimmy, you could start with this. What predicate devices are applicable to be used for the 510K pathway? So maybe just a bit of a summary on our initial regulatory assessment of the pathway moving forward for the Veris device.
Yeah, so the predicate devices are the existing port devices. There are many out there that we can choose from, and that will be the main predicate with reference to other connected devices and standards for monitoring parameters such as temperature and heart rate. So the main predicate is the existing port technology with reference to the other monitoring technologies.
Great. I guess maybe I'll take a crack at this, and why don't you chime in if you have anything to add. The question is, can you comment on your view on the path and timing to receiving Medicare and private coverage reimbursement for various products, i.e. the intelligent vascular access, assuming 510(k) approval? And then the second part, I think, answers the questioner's own question, which is, do you view Veris's future product as falling within existing CPT codes, or do you think it'll require new codes? So again, just to reiterate, that's what's amazing about this model. So there are existing CPT codes, which Dr. Mitchell showed, both for obviously for the implantation of the device as well as for remote patient monitoring. And we are not dependent. The model is not dependent on receiving Medicare and private coverage reimbursement. This is a subscription-based model where we'll be charging the oncology practice or the cancer care center directly, not Medicare, not private payers, on a subscription basis. So they will have the right to be on our platform to receive the remote patient monitoring, and that provides us with an immediate margin from our point of view, if you take the cost of the device, and from their point of view, because they'll be reimbursed both for the implantation of the device, which is again an existing code, and for the remote monitoring itself. So in terms of the timelines, as I think you're suggesting towards revenue, it is not going to be dependent within the current business model on Medicare and private coverage. Dr. Shah, do you want to maybe comment on how that sort of fits in within your the practice models that you work within? I realize you're at a large academic institution, but perhaps there might be some additional insights you can provide on that.
No, that's exactly right. I would just say that we are, kind of going towards value-based care in general at Stanford as well, and that reimbursement will largely be tied to cost sharing with insurance companies. But in general, I completely agree with what you said.
Right. So another interesting question, which again we've touched on, but I think it's a good opportunity to drive it a little bit more. So the question is Veris competing with big tech companies like Apple, and if so, how would you compete with such large tech companies? So let me just start the conversation on that. Maybe Tim and Jimmy and Sunny, if you'd like to chime in, and Dr. Shah as well. So it's what Veris is doing is taking this existing paradigm between physicians, the facilities they work at, and patients, and applying digital tools to that, and using modern technologies to facilitate those and to create value for all the stakeholders, as we've outlined before. That's very different than what the large tech companies have been doing, at least in terms of the device monitoring side, where it's been very much consumer-oriented wearables, non-implantables. And as such, we don't really see that as competition, but we also, as we noted, the big tech companies are also working on the data side, and we're leveraging that with our relationship with Microsoft on the building of sort of the highway for the data to flow as opposed to the technologies themselves. Tim, do you want to maybe reiterate some of the points that we talked about earlier on as to where the big tech companies are focused on the hardware side, perhaps?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned and I mentioned earlier, I think they're much more focused on consumer wellness in general. Yes, they're getting more specific in certain areas, but I think as you think about the device, it's adding value, to their watch and to their phone and to that ecosystem of solutions. And I also think I'm a big fan of the Whoop product, right? Which helps me track a host of things, mostly around sleep and recovery, but they're general solutions, I think, that exist here. And so I see it less around direct competition. I think as we build out our Veris ecosystem, I think, again, not trying to be the kitchen sink of all things associated with healthcare, but getting very specific and more narrow with an appropriate lens, I think allows us to stay very clear in the areas that we think we can knit best in, and we can create more value to that. And I think that is a much different approach than I think most in the tech space have been taking so far.
Great. There's a question about customer privacy. I think we touched on that. Thanks, Hassan, for that question. That the regulations with regard to HIPAA, high tech, and others around the transmittal of patient data in an identifiable way is highly regulated. We'll be subject to that. The FDA and other regulators will provide significant oversight on that. Dr. Shah, do you have any sort of points of concern? I know in telemedicine there are some new issues around privacy that I'm sure you've dealt with and you've managed. But do you feel like the current infrastructure that's provided to us by the regulators has been sufficient to protect patient privacy?
Yes, it's been very patient-centric, and I would say that the regulations that we do have in place do ensure patient safety as well as patient privacy. I think that at times there can be the innovators can feel that this could be somewhat stifling because it's difficult to move at the pace that you like. However, I think it's absolutely critical that we do have infrastructure in place to maintain patient safety and privacy. But I think those regulations are very well regarded right now.
Right. We have a question about the Veris's intellectual. Thank you, Dr. Shah. We have a question about Veris's intellectual property portfolio. Obviously, prior to doing the acquisition, we spent a lot of time, both with internal and outside counsel, on that diligence. Frankly, we're a bit surprised at how good a job our Dr. Mitchell and his colleagues had done in what we thought would be a fairly crowded space. So perhaps, Jimmy, you could talk a bit about the strength of the portfolio, both on the platform side as well as on the device side.
Sure. So it continues to grow. We have 1 issued patent and 7 patent applications pending, with some of the pending applications being, kind of an omnibus application that we can draw upon for many claims in many different realms. But we really looked at this holistically in building the IP portfolio, looking at not just the device, but also the platform, the data, and the clinical utility of what we're building. And how can we provide broad intellectual property protection in all of those aspects? So for example, our initial granted patent is very targeted towards the use of this technology to monitor cancer patients for complications such as sepsis. There are very kind of traditional and specific device patent claims that we have filed to protect the device itself. But again, there's a lot of work being done on protecting the platform, the clinical utility of the platform, and some of those higher level analytics that we'll be drawing upon to create value.
Great. I think I'll direct the next question to Dr. Shah, because as a practicing oncologist, and you and Jimmy talked about the data with wearables, but the fact that patient adherence was an issue. And so the question is, why do we think that patient adherence will be better with an implantable device where this is incorporated into their chemo port versus the adherence issues that have come up when people have tried to use Fitbits and other types of technologies to improve care, where we know that adherence can be a problem?
Sure. Well, I can just tell you that from clinical trials that have been done in the past, even with wearables, where you think that it's a wristband that you're wearing, that you're just giving continuous data, 30% of patients were unable to sync their Fitbit with their phone or with their computer. So there's still a technology piece that is very essential for engagement. In addition to that, I think the physiologic data that we have will always be continuous. So always there's no issue of adherence or compliance because it's literally implanted within you. So I think it'll take care of a lot of the adherence issues. And we also know that the data that I need as a clinician often is not just subjective data that is coming from the patient, but really this objective physiologic data that I need to help make a decision about whether to give a patient chemotherapy or radiation or whatnot. So I think adherence will be certainly improved with the implantable.
Yeah, I think anytime you don't require patient input and it's automatic, I think we know that adherence is going to go up. Yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. We're running a bit short on time, but I think I'll sort of take the prerogative to extend it for 5 or so minutes because we have some great questions. So we'll keep going if everybody's okay with that. There was a question about the 2.0 device and its relations to the 1.0 device, which you highlighted in one of your slides, Jimmy. So just to be clear, that what we'll be submitting for clearance in the second half of next year will be the 1.0 device, which is tailored to oncology patients. So many of the things that you saw on the additional things that we're looking to do and are part of an R&D project that we believe we'll be able to incorporate in the second generation device are targeted, like, cardiac rhythm and other types of arterial pressure and things like that will be for the broader application. So Jim, would you like to, you did a survey, for example, of oncologists and asked them what parameters would be most useful in their practice. You maybe touch on that a little bit to provide some color.
That's right. Yeah, back in the very early days of OncoDisc, we did a pretty comprehensive survey of oncologists trying to ascertain what are the most critical physiologic parameters that are important to the oncologists as they take care of patients. And then we did a comprehensive survey of the technology landscape to look at, okay, of these parameters, what can we realistically monitor today? And fortunately, those lists actually lined up very well, and that's what you see in our 1.0 feature set. But as we go forward, we know that there are additional parameters that can bring value to oncology care, and then also different parameters that would be beneficial in, say, cardiovascular or renal diseases. And so those are R&D projects that will lead to 2.0 and beyond. Those features, like Lishan said, are not going to be part of that initial 510K application. But we've already initiated a discussion with potential R&D partners on developing these technologies. And we expect that they'll be incorporated into a commercial product probably 12 to 24 months after 1.0.
Great. Another great question: for elderly patients or compromised patients who do not have or know how to use their cell phones, how will this product work for them? Again, I'll ask maybe you, and if Dr. Shah, you'd like to chime in on that as well.
Sure. So the beauty of the implant is that it will operate in the background and communicate data even if the patient never signs on to the app and isn't interfacing on a regular basis. So we will have access to the physiologic data, even if there's no integration of interaction with the patients. That said, we want to drive that interaction and that usability. And so, taking into account the typical cancer patient age and demographic, we are integrating all of those considerations into the user design. So having a simple design that's very intuitive, has very clear and kind of large text, large images, easy to use buttons and other features for navigation, so that really just about anybody can use it with very little instruction. And I'll just add that even with my experience, there's this idea out there that certain generations struggle with technology. But most of the patients that I've seen in the last 5 years, regardless of their age, they come in with their smartphone. And when we talk about their schedule, they open up their calendar and they start texting their contacts. And so I think that every generation is more tech savvy than we give credit for.
My 86-year-old mom would fall in that category. So just a real quick question. I'm trying to do some of these quickly. Which a question about the process of basically getting the device in the market. So, as we said, we're targeting the second half of next year for it to be available for use in cancer patients. The process for that is completing the design verification validation process, submitting to FDA for the device. There's some fairly minor hurdles that we have to do for the actual software side of things, and we believe it's a 510K process with good predicates. So that's where that's the process before we can actually see it on the market, hopefully by the end of in the second half of next year. There's a question here which I'll summarize, Jimmy, about. I think it would be good to explain to people what's involved in the implantation of a port, how common it is, what percentage of cancer patients get it, how invasive is it, where is it done, what's the recovery, and so forth, compared to wearing a device, which again, perhaps you could reemphasize the benefits of an implantable over a wearable, since patients are going to get it anyway.
Sure. So again, these devices are implanted every day in cancer patients, typically implanted by interventional radiologists, who are radiologists who do procedures in a minimally invasive outpatient procedure that requires conscious sedation. So there's typically no general anesthesia. The procedure time takes about 30 to 60 minutes, and patients will typically go home after the procedure is done, but patients can actually go straight from interventional radiology to oncology and get an infusion of their anti-cancer medication right after the port is implanted. Today, if we look at what percentage of cancer patients that are undergoing infusion therapy have ports, today it's about half in the US. So there's definitely room to expand that market by having a more compelling offering. There are also now multiple prospective randomized studies to show that ports are safer, more effective, and more cost-effective than other forms of medium and long-term vascular access devices. So that would be things like PICC lines and tunnel catheters, where there's some external component to the device. And then to touch on, the comparison with a wearable, again, a wearable doesn't serve any therapeutic purpose in cancer care. Today, you can't infuse drugs through a wearable. You can't deliver therapy. So we still need to have that vascular access for therapy. And then again, with a wearable, patients can take it off, can leave it at home. And we're talking about, 6 months of therapy, even longer for a lot of patients. So to adhere on a regular basis to any kind of wearable tech for that duration, we just haven't ever seen that in medicine. Whereas in an implant, we know from the world of cardiovascular diseases that once there's an active implant in place, that it's going to run in the background, and we don't have to do much else to make sure we can capture the data.
Great, thanks. I have a couple of questions that touch on the question of the sort of the spectrum of oncology practices between smaller practices and cancer centers and large networks. Perhaps maybe Dr. Shah, you work obviously at a large academic institution. Perhaps you could give us a bit of insight on that.
Sure. So in the U.S. right now, there are, I believe, 13,000 medical oncologists and several other surgeons, as well as radiation oncologists. But just in terms of medical oncology, which is largely given to use, is around 13,000. In terms of the different healthcare systems, there's large tertiary care academic medical systems, and then there's also large community-based practices such as the Kaisers. And those types of systems as well. I believe the question's about the number of cancer patients that are relevant to Veris technology. So, there's well over 1 million new cancer patients diagnosed every single year in the United States. And I would say that, probably at least 30 to 40% of them will be undergoing some type of infusion-based therapy and may actually be eligible for a port in the future. For those patients with advanced disease, like Jimmy was saying earlier, is probably at least 50% of patients will require a port during their therapy. So, quite a few patients, quite different healthcare systems, but all applicable to this type of technology, though.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shah. That's great. Let me just trying to sort of collate questions here. A couple of questions on what we hinted at, but maybe didn't get to spend enough time on, which is the application in clinical research, clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies, and how it could be useful for them to have access to this continuous data. And perhaps you could touch on that, Dr. Shah, and then Jimmy talk about how that could be represent a substantive contribution to future revenues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one that's actually most intriguing would be getting pharmacokinetic data from our patients for early phase clinical trials. So when a patient comes to us for like a phase 1 clinical trial in early development, we'll have to keep that patient in the chair for about 8 hours, even if their infusion was already only 1 hour long, largely because we're just drawing blood from them and getting different time points to see how their drug is distributed in their body over time. If we had a better system of doing that, maybe the patient wouldn't have to come in as often. And so I think that would be one of the big advantage of this type of data is to get pharmacotherapy data. In addition to that, we can also see or physiologic changes in blood pressure, in heart rate, with the introduction of these medications as well. So I think a very intriguing space for clinical trials research.
Jimmy, would you like to add to that, maybe from a bit of a business perspective, and then I think we can wrap up.
Yeah, so if we think about the process of getting a new drug through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, this is a very expensive undertaking for a pharmaceutical company, and there's a risk in every step of the way that whatever they're pursuing, whatever the product is, that it's going to fail. And if you have a failure in a big phase 3 study at the end of that development, we're talking about billions of dollars of losses for the drug companies. And a lot of the times we see a phase 3 study fail, not because the drug doesn't provide a benefit, but because those benefits are washed out by either toxicities that couldn't be managed or toxicities that just were a bit of a surprise when the drug gets put into a bigger population. So we can provide data for patients on clinical study that can allow the pharmaceutical companies to maybe look at their phase 1 and phase 2 patients, look at nuances in the physiologic data and those patients' medical histories, and use that to make smarter decisions about inclusion and exclusion criteria for the bigger studies, as well as study design. What are the appropriate endpoints that we're going to look for? And then once patients are on study, using the physiologic monitoring to actually track for adverse events and intervene quickly before those adverse events lead to a bad outcome that is then going to negate the good outcome that we might be seeing from the drug. This enhancing or enabling this process of drug discovery not only helps the pharmaceutical companies financially, but it also potentially gets therapeutics out there to patients earlier and sooner. And so to provide that clinical trial support can open up big sources of business for Veris Health.
Okay, well, there's still more questions. I'd love to get to all of them, but we're 10 minutes over our time. We're going to have to stop, but just wanted to first thank all the panelists, obviously my colleagues at PAVmed, as well as particular thanks to Dr. Shah, and of course for all the participants. We almost hit 300 participants. We're really, really grateful that you guys all spent 2 hours of your day to learn more about this technology, and it's been great to have the opportunity to do a bit more in depth than we're typically able to do. Any questions that were not asked can be sent to info@pavmed.com, and we look forward to hearing from you there. And we'd also encourage you to follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn, where you'll see regular information posted about PAVmed, as well as Veris and our other technologies and companies. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.